All right, friends, I'm back today to talk about a specific and perhaps an odd topic, but one I think worth discussing because in practicing astrology, I've come across this enough and to see its problems that I see it as something worth discussing. And that is people who are malefic worshippers. They idealize, let's say, Saturn, Mars, Rahu, or Ketu. And now, having seen the patterns of such individuals, I can see that this is actually a very problematic thing that we do. We have a couple of misunderstandings. One, misunderstanding the existential functions of these planets and what they're trying to articulate. And two, these archetypes are actually part of our own drives. And when we overemphasize on one of them, we start to become like them. And if they're malefic, as I'll discuss throughout this video, it's creating a particular kind of a psychological configuration in us that it's life-denying and life-destroying in a lot of ways. We become dysfunctional. They create abnormalities in a lot of ways. And when I'm talking about malefics, I'm talking about Mars, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. Sun is a mild malefic, but I'm going to leave that one out. And as for today, before getting on with it, I think I'm just going to get through Saturn because talking about finitude of time, time's kind of limited today. But I'll come back to cover Mars, Rahu, and Ketu. And before moving on, the algorithms need this, and I would immensely appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment if this content's valuable to you, because this will permit me to continue doing what I absolutely love. And it always warms my heart when I hear that it's been helpful to someone else. So if you could do that, that would be great. And without further ado, let's get right into this malefic nature of this discussion today. Okay, I don't know if you guys have ever thought about what this word malefic means. It's a strange one. You know, when you come across it for the first time in astrology, you're like, malefic, what the hell? Malefic actually comes from a Latin word that is maleficent. That's where it comes from. And that which is maleficent is referring to that which causes harm and things that destroy things. So it's talking about something that has a negative influence. And the Latin word actually for it is maleficentia, which means doing evil. That's what the root word is coming from. So maleficent, or a shorthand malefic, is referring to that which causes harm, that which is evil, that which is destructive, and something that has very detrimental effects. So planets that are malefic, they're doing malevolent things. That's another word that's related here, right? And to be malevolent is to have the desire or to harbor the desire to want to cause harm to others, which means that which is ill-wishing. That's where the word malevolent comes from. It's describing attitudes and intentions that intend to cause harm. And just to give some context, benefic comes from the word beneficent. And this is describing that which does acts of kindness. It's charitable, and there's a sense of goodness in it. It's something that produces something that is good. And that which does good has positive outcomes. So when we talk about benefics such as Venus and Jupiter, that is our understanding of them too. And their nature is of having benevolence. They're benevolent planets. So they're well-meaning and they're kind. They have our best interest at heart, unlike the malefics, which are malevolent. So benefic refers to that which is doing good and creating positive outcomes, whereas malefics are referring to harmful actions that bring about destruction and negative outcomes. So that's something to keep in mind. So when we become malefic worshippers, even if we don't have explicit understanding of the etymology of these words and what they're describing, just through the usage of language and knowing some of the symbolism of these malefic planets, we innately understand what they're referring to. So now there are some of us who come to embody these and want to emulate them and idealize them and worship them. So it becomes a problem. It's going to create psychological problems. And let's start with Saturn and see what we can extract from that and what kind of negative states of mind or intentions that it can produce. And I want to say one other thing, actually, before getting into it. Even if we want to anthropomorphize these planets and give them personality attributes and narratives as human beings have done it in many different cultures. For example, when we go to the Greek and the Roman culture, when we talk about Saturn story, Saturn's known for killing his own dad. When we go to the Vedic traditions and Vedic astrology, we see Shani, which is also Saturn. He has contempt for his own father from the moment that he's born. So these planets, even if we're going to anthropomorphize them, they do not want, nor are they seeking our love and our affection. What they are seeking is fear. What they are seeking is they want us to tremble in our shoes. So that warmth and that love that we want to give, that's not even what these planets archetypes want, not even in their stories. They are not trying to make friends with anyone. You don't hear stories of warmth and benevolent ways of being from the get-go as they arrive into the world, and all their action, it is malevolent. So even when we consider that, it's like, what are we embodying again? What are we trying to do with idealizing these malefic energies? So now that said, I think that covers it. Let's get into Saturn. So let's start with looking at Saturn from that value-free perspective, which is an existential function, a force in nature that has a purpose working with other forces of nature. Let's conceptualize it like that for a minute to understand it as itself and what it's trying to do. And then we're going to take it into our psychological realm, where now the subjectivity is coming into play, and how we have categories of valuation and understanding things, and the impact of this value-free drive, force, function in that way. But let's just begin with that existential function of Saturn. So when Saturn serves as a mean and not an end unto itself, its role is crucial for preserving different facets of existence. It's permitting the longevity of what is to remain in existence in its existing form. It's protecting, in a lot of ways, the longevity of existing structures and relationships. For example, Saturn as an existential function creates confinement. Saturn is about boundaries, limitations. It restricts things. It keeps things very close to each other. It's condensing it almost. And if we think about it, this function of Saturn is holding different facets of existence in each other's proximity. Like even when we talk about, scientists talk about the universe is expanding. All the planets are moving further away from each other, the solar system, the galaxies. And it's going to come to a point that things are so far apart each other that every sun is going to die. The planets are going to die. So Saturn is preventing this entropy from occurring. It's confining, it's putting limits and limitation on different facets of existence, so they remain in each other's proximity to be relational. So in a lot of ways, is preventing the dissolution of structure and order, and Saturn is related to traditions, for example, and its symbolism. So in a lot of ways, Saturn's function is important for binding things by containing them. And this allows a system, for example, to remain functional and stable. It's stabilizing because it's ensuring the relationship between different parts, different existing parts, where we could say the sum of all these existing parts is existence in itself. This is Saturn's function. And we can see an example of this in astrology where Saturn's exalted and debilitated. Let's take Saturn's exaltation. Saturn's exalted in the sign of Libra. What is Libra? It's one of the most relational signs. It's an air sign. And when we think about the air moves everywhere. You can't confine it. It doesn't have bounds and boundaries. In fact, when let's say we take Mercury into the sign of Libra, or even Venus in its own sign, they don't have the power to contain this air aspect, to maintain the proximities that are needed to create longevity of relationships. But what does Saturn do? You bring Saturn into the sign of Libra, into this air sign where everything's trying to be scattered. That which comes into the proximity of another, into relation with another, Saturn confines it. Saturn puts a boundary around it, creates a kind of a structure and a molding where, let's say, these two people who are married cannot get out of this. It just concretizes the dynamics. So it's creating a kind of a framework that's permitting the longevity of relationships. So Saturn becomes exalted in Libra. Saturn's preventing outward movements in the sign of Libra. And in a lot of ways is fostering stability in a relationship, right? Now let's go to Saturn and the sign of Aries. What is Aries trying to do? Aries is outward movement. It's this outward externalizing propulsion. And people think when Saturn goes into the sign of Aries, just Aries becomes too restrictive and it can't do that. No, when a planet is debilitated, it actually loses its power to do what it does. So Saturn can't constrict in the sign of Aries. It can't put those limitations and boundaries. The sign of Aries, in fact, becomes a little bit more reckless when Saturn's in the sign of Aries. Things become more dangerous. We become more accident prone. We're not staying in proper relational dynamics that are confined and controlled. Saturn in Libra is able to do that, and in the sign of Aries cannot do that. And if we just take Saturn as an end unto itself and not as a means, not as a function, not as a drive, but something that we just over focus on, like we love Saturn, we idealize Saturn and believe that that Saturnine way of being is a good way of being in the world. Even from that existential sense, Saturn is suffocating things. Because if Saturn was not working with other forces in nature, and we only had Saturn, Saturn's constricting, Saturn's negating, Saturn's deducing. So Saturn's becoming life-denying. But Saturn as a means, as only a drive in the whole system and how it's working, Saturn's permitting longevity of things. But Saturn by itself will just compress things. You know, it's entrapment. It's cutting everything off from its growth. And everything's starting to lose its vitality. And Saturn represents illness, decay, old age, and ultimately death. So Saturn starts to have an overemphasis on that aspect of its function, if Saturn is the only thing. Instead of preserving life and giving it its longevity, it suffocates it. It's actually reducing the world in that naysaying, negating kind of way so that it collapses on itself. When Saturn becomes the sole function, everything's just shriveling, collapsing, and just getting annihilated out of existence. And when we go into the psychological realm, when we cannot grow anymore, where we feel trapped, where we feel like we're suffocating, the experience of that is pain and suffering. That's the experience of Saturn by itself as itself. And it's this that should give us a clue as to why we shouldn't idealize Saturn. While Saturn's role is critical for establishing order and structure and maintain the integrity of the entire system so that it remains functional, we have to see it as a tool that's facilitating something much bigger, a system that is constantly changing, growing, and it cannot be so restricted and confined. Otherwise, it dies. I mean, to idealize Saturn in this way is just zero movement, confinement, suffocating, and losing life. That's what it is. But when we go to the psychological realm of why do we come to love and idealize and glorify Saturn, we'll see that such individuals, and sometimes we will do this without even that explicit declaration of I love Saturn and glorifying Saturn, that we're gravitating towards Saturnine qualities because of certain underlying deficiencies that are within ourselves. I mean, if you think about it, it's hard to glorify Saturn when you take into consideration all of its significations. They are pretty much denoting things that we as human beings do not want in our life in general, except maybe 2 or 3 of its symbols. And just to briefly mention Saturn's symbols, Saturn's primary symbol is negativity. It's about deduction, deducing, reducing, constraint, restraint, limitation, putting things in bounds, confining it, old age, decay, death, scarcity, poverty. And when we come to the couple that might have a positive resonance or like longevity and endurance. And again, even those can turn into stubbornness, and lacking adaptability, which again can take on a negative connotation. So when we think about it, why would someone gravitate towards these significations as a mode of being in the world, as a mode of being within themselves and interacting with other people? If we dig deep, we'll see that there are some unresolved issues that the person's grappling with. There are some unmet needs that the person has that has morphed into meeting these needs, or they feel that they need to meet these needs in these ways. And if we take one of these psychological factors into consideration, and when we have a good look at this person who is glorifying Saturn, what they will express usually is a lack of control in their life, and they have this feeling like they're fighting against chaos at all times. In a sense, this person wants to put limitation, boundaries, constraints, and structures around everything because they just feel overwhelmed by the uncertainty of their life, which they are interpreting as something that's very chaotic. It's completely out of their control. For example, all of us, when life becomes too unpredictable or uncontrollable, we start to gravitate towards the Saturnine qualities because we're looking to have some control. That entropy that's happening in our own lives, we want to prevent it from happening. But when you glorify Saturn, that becomes your psychological way of being in the world. And that's what becomes problematic. Because what we're talking about here is a defense mechanism against something that, if we really think about it, we can't control. We are under the illusion of we can control other people. We can control external circumstances. We can control every variable in our life. But in reality, we cannot. So if we become fixated on this need to control, we're asking for a lot of problems ahead. I mean, the person might be under the impression that this restrictive way that they have is stabilizing them or maintaining some semblance of order and structure in their life, but it's actually destroying themselves and everything around them. And when you dig deep, they are using this control as a coping mechanism to deal with their own feelings of vulnerability. What the person should actually be grappling with is the way that they fear certain things and the way that they feel vulnerable in certain situations, rather than trying to impose external control on other people or constantly controlling their own internal landscape. To give you an example, let's say someone is in a very dysfunctional or an abusive relationship. If we don't embrace the Saturnine quality, we're not going to try to make that relationship work by controlling every variable. Control the environment so you don't set the person off. Regulate the other person's emotions, become even subservient to them, lose your sense of self, lose your health and your vitality so that you don't set them off. Constantly control your own inner landscape and suppress and repress your emotions, despite what this person's doing, because you're trying to control all the variables to keep this relationship intact. The solution here is to actually admit, I feel vulnerable in this relationship. I'm scared in this relationship. Fear is a Saturn signification. I fear this person. I fear this circumstance. This circumstance is actually beyond my control. When we actually start to address the real factors, the underlying issues, we'll get to the bottom of it. But that's artificial external control on other people and ourselves and the environment is just an illusion. And it's going to bring the system, if we can call that a system, it's going to bring it to the brinks of its break and extinction eventually. I mean, the person's trying to get a sense of safety with, let's say, a predator in this situation by controlling things. I mean, a logical Saturn represents rationality. Is that rational? Is that a rational way of thinking it by trying to exert control in this situation? If you're in an abusive dynamic, the only thing to do is to get the hell out, not to try to control the situation. So this need for control is not addressing the root cause. It's just dealing with the symptoms. We have to get to the root of things, and that control is actually preventing us. It's like rock formation, one layer on top of another, on top of another. And then we get so far away from the bottom cause that we can't do it, and then we can't break these cycles of control. And when you think about it, what else comes with this need to control, this over control over everything? It creates rigidity, right? when we glorify Saturn as the only thing and as something to emulate and the way to live, we lose the spontaneity for life. I mean, if we look at life in itself, is spontaneously just popping up everywhere. You can't keep exerting some sort of a control. We have to permit some degree of chaos in any ecosystem for that ecosystem to be functional. For example, when we look at a forest, we think, oh my God, nature and its order. To some degree, when you zoom out, the forest is absolutely chaotic. Things are just popping out of every other direction. Things are dying, other things are replacing it, things are eating things. We can't control all the variable. And if you want to be rigid and you want to impose control on that forest, the best you can do is to make a garden out of it, but you're creating a kind of a frail ecosystem. Because if you are the variable that now has control over this garden to be a garden, all nature has to do is to kill you off as a variable, to take you out, and that garden is gone. This is the illusion of control that we have over life, right? And when we become rigid, we lose that adaptability and flexibility, which is also required for life. Life is always changing. It's always in a state of flux, and we got to know how to roll with the punches. It's like a tree. As grand as it may be, it has movement in it. It's not rigid, it's flexible. So a storm comes, it bends to extremes, but when the storm is gone, because it's not rigid, because it's not trying to enforce that sense of control over the winds, it outsurvives the winds. So that rigidity that Saturnine quality will bring will eventually break us. It will break everything within our environment. And there's something to be said about flexibility as a human being, because that's how we experience life. I mean, think about creativity. If you're a creative person, it's one of the most joyful aspects of life, because you just keep your mind open and spontaneously things just come to mind. They just pop into place. But if you're trying to control every thought, if you're trying to control your creativity, nothing ever flourishes. The mind becomes rigid and it starts to actually become very uncreative. You see those people all the time. They say the same thing all the time. Every time that you see them, there's no more room for growth. And we feel our sense of joy, the greatest joy, where we feel like life's flourishing, we're growing, life around us is growing. So this is another problem with wanting control, because that's what that Saturnine quality will do to our psychology. And another thing about control. So, that saying, we can't do anything to others before we do them to ourselves. So by wanting to exert control on external variables, by restricting them, limiting them, don't say that. In my presence, don't you dare do that. Go do that because I said that. That feeling that we're bringing out in the world, we had to feel it ourselves first. And then we're feeling it internally. We're exerting it externally. The external world is giving us a very negative feedback. And this is just feeding itself. It's like an infestation almost. This is actually what causes unresolved trauma in a person. Because internally, you feel like you're creating a certain kind of a situation because you're controlling it, but your external feedback from the world is so negative, and the emotions that it's causing in you again, it actually creates internal instability. It creates a mind and an emotional landscape that is very unhealthy. I literally, when I think about that, I think about maggots sitting on top of something and just crawling on top of each other. The emotional landscape looks like that. When this negative feedback loop is happening internally, exerting itself externally, getting that feedback loop, it's just perpetuating it. And this will actually create more instability, and it creates deeper issues internally, which just keeps repeating the cycle. And this is very unhealthy. Sometimes we just got to let go of the control, let other people feel the way they want to feel. We don't like it, but that's how they feel, rather than constantly trying to exert that control to modify their actions and even how they feel. And what does this do to the external world when we constantly do that? At some point, they become Saturnine. The external world starts to shun us. The word shunny, as the name for Saturn in the Vedic tradition. They start to shun us. They don't want to interact with us. Too heavy, too negative, too pessimistic, too cynical, so controlling. People want to be themselves. People want to do what people do. And by constantly trying to control other people's environments and how they ought to be, we push them away. So this creates isolation, loneliness, and we're social beings. And from so much research, we know no matter how much we're trying to convince ourselves that we are these Saturnine beings and we're okay with our aloneness, it's not healthy. We're supposed to have these connections, and it's the way to grow. I've said this in another video too. When we're sitting by ourselves, we're perfect beings. Nothing's wrong with us. It's only in relation and in interaction with others and the external world that we come to see our own shortcomings, how we can grow, how we can expand our horizon, how we can get rid of all the glitchiness that's within us. So again, this external control is deteriorating who and what we are. It's suffocating us. We need other people, and the Saturnine quality pushes other people away, so it's not healthy. And you know, this kind of control is anti-reality, which Saturn itself represents reality. And I say this is why Saturn doesn't want us to glorify Saturn. Saturn's like, I prefer that you fear me because you'll get a grip on the harshness of reality, how insecure it is, how constantly shifting it is, how vulnerable you are. I want you to understand your vulnerability. A countless amount of things can annihilate you in an instant. I need you to understand that. And I was talking about the existential function of Saturn. Saturn's actually trying to keep things in the proper proximity so that they remain relational. So long as we're scared, the function of fear, which is another Saturn symbolism, because I fear jumping from the 14th floor where I live, I'm going to remain connected to all other facets of my life. Because of that fear, I'm going to eat healthy. Because of that fear, I'm going to remain connected with certain people and make sure I'm not connected to other people. So Saturn wants us to feel our vulnerability, and the vulnerability has a function. The fear has a function. That's the only kind of security that we actually have, not when we exert control. We are not in control of our external life and it's happening. It's an illusion to think that we control other people. We don't. We might be able to control them for a certain amount of time. Little bit of leeway, they will make sure to get rid of you. Why wouldn't they? Who wants to be under this constraining, limiting force of Saturn just getting crushed because it's outside the parameter of its proper function? It's suffocating. No one wants to suffocate. So this overexertion of control is giving us a false sense of security, which is actually very anti-Saturn. Saturn wants us to feel scared and vulnerable. That is what's preventing the entropy of our psychology and our actions, which is maintaining our longevity. And another thing that this control will do, it creates missed opportunities in life, right? I mean, there's so much overemphasis on caution and restraint that we don't really live. And we're actually, when you dig deep into the psychological components here, there's so much fear. That's why there's so much control. And this makes a person pessimistic and cynical. It makes a person, worst of all, lose trust in life. And we need trust in life. We cannot survive life without trust. From the minute that we wake up, we open our eyes and put our feet on the ground, we have to trust countless amount of things. When we're driving down the street, this car is going this way, you're going this way. The only thing separating you is a freaking line. You are trusting other people. Money is a system of trust. We're constantly using this currency of trust just to get through life. So a person who has so much fear and they think they can control all these variables, it's indicating that they're lacking trust in themselves and others in the world. They're distrustful of life in general. So an actual remedy here for Saturn is not more Saturn. Saturn's breaking the person in every sense of the word. The remedy here is Jupiter. Jupiter is trust. Jupiter is optimism. It's hope. It's faith. That's what the person needs. Have some hope and faith that the other people, life and the world will do the right thing. You don't need to control it. For example, have some trust in yourself that if you are in a bad situation, you actually don't need to control that situation, bring everything to the brink of breakdown. Trust yourself that you will leave. Trust that you can take care of yourself. That's what the Jupiter remedy here is. Venus is a remedy here. It's about receptivity, being soft, acceptance. We have to accept other people as they are, in the totality and the wholeness of who they are, and take them in. And when we can do that, we actually love someone. And there are people that we can't do that with. And we're not receptive to those people, but this control, like, I want to love you, but you stay here and I stay here. And this is the boundary. This kind of stuff drives all of us insane by the end of life, and we will all be defeated. And I see so many people in their advanced ages, they have let go of these ways of being. They just see it as senseless, pointless, because it doesn't get us anywhere. Another remedy is to embody the lunar qualities of nurturing, caring, again, being receptive, allowing things in, rather than this iron fist of control. It just brings life to its knees. It's life negating, even though the person thinks that they're preserving life, that they're maintaining the structure of this and that I am the one who's making this person do this. They would die without me. These are serious, serious problems that all of us negotiate with to some degree at different points of life. But people who glorify Saturn are just fixated on this. And the remedy to their problem, which is fear, vulnerability, being scared of the unpredictable nature of life, unpredictable nature of other people, it's actually Saturn is not its remedy. So that's something to be said about control. Another psychological factor that comes in with Saturn, and why people embrace this insane Saturnine quality, when you dig deep into their psychology, there's a fear of failure. I'm going to have a sip of water because I'm starting to hear my voice in my ear. That means I'm going to lose my voice soon. Okay, I'm back. I was thinking I could endorse Kit Kat maybe with all the breaks I take. Break me off a piece of that Kit Kat bar. I could use some chocolate right now. I love chocolate. But back to fear of failure. Both fear and failure are represented by Saturn, but they have a function, both fear and failure. And if we're going to put those two words together in terms of fear of failure, because failure is actually saying something about not being in the right relational dynamic in the world. Something is causing injury or harm. So it's natural for us to have a fear of failure. And every time that we go outside the bounds of our routines and what we normally do, we face the prospect of failure. This is very natural. Like, I went to the gym today. I added 5 pounds to a particular exercise that I was doing. There was muscle failure in half the time. And in that moment of failure, there's a panic in the brain. Even though you know nothing's going to happen to you, it's just like, put the weights down, put the weights down. It's just every time we try to go outside the comfort zone, which is required for the growth process, this notion of fear and failure come hand in hand. But the failure is actually showing us that we're moving beyond the bounds and the limitation of our normative way. We're trying to expand our realm of possibility on our horizon. We're trying something new. But if this fear of failure comes to be connected to constantly saying no to things because we don't want to experience it, because now we're experiencing it as a kind of a rejection. Rejection is also symbolized by Saturn. We will not grow. We're going to be stagnant human beings. And to avoid this feeling of failure and rejection becomes a very prominent theme for people who glorify Saturn. It becomes a psychological refuge. it becomes a framework to prevent any kind of risk taking or trying anything new in life. And essentially, again, when you dig deep into it, they're shielding their vulnerabilities. They don't want to feel vulnerable. It has a lot to do with that. And a lot of times, people who glorify Saturn will explain this as self-restraint, and it's expressed and rationalized as a kind of a virtue. They'll even see suffering and denial as a noble way of living. I just don't do that. I don't allow myself to do that. But when you actually dig in, they're using this rationalization to avoid many, many situations in life. Anything that requires uncertainty, competition, trying something new, just expanding the realm of possibility becomes none because they cannot allow themselves to feel vulnerable. There's a fear about vulnerability. So it's a fear of rejection, it's a fear of failure. They're always working in confined parameters and routines that they've done a million times. There's no variation, no variables are introduced, just the same thing. And then they'll represent these as the ideal ways for living a disciplined life, for being responsible and having moral fortitude, for example. And the problem doesn't end there, right? So if we have a fear of failure and rejection because we just cannot let those inner vulnerabilities and our inadequacies to come to the surface and we don't want to deal with it, some of the side effects of this, other psychological problems that it causes, can be things like over preparation and perfectionism can come out of this. Like a fear of failure will constantly push someone to over prepare for something. They have this obsessiveness about how things need to be perfect in this way, in this alignment, in this lineup. It's almost as if they cannot handle any mistake or something straying off. Again, it has to do with that control issue too, right? And what does this do? It creates delays in life, it creates burnouts, frustration, and essentially the feeling that the person will have of themselves is I'm not good enough. How long can you move around the world with a feeling of I'm not good enough till there's a sense of worthlessness? These are also significations of Saturn. It's almost as if they have to do the right thing so that success is guaranteed. But success often cannot come if we don't move outside the parameters of what we know and what's been routine in us. So this becomes a chronic avoidance of risk at any cost. And essentially what they're doing is that they're avoiding their own limits and limitations. And for life to flourish, that boundary in small increments must be pushed consistently and constantly. And this kind of avoidance, just, you see people, decades have passed, and they're in the same situation and they're miserable about it. But everything just starts to feel like a huge risk, even things that other people will take for granted as a fact of life. That's just how you move through things. It just becomes a point of paralysis for someone who has this kind of a mindset. And, essentially, they are not inadequate for not knowing how to do certain things, but because they avoid that risk and that movement outside the parameters of what's known, where they might feel like they're losing control again, they start to have these self-defeating beliefs about what they can and cannot do. So these things that are normal in everyone's life become these points of inadequacy in their own mind, that I'm inadequate in this part of life. That fear and that feeling that rejection might come from it gets doubled down. So a person who glorifies Saturn, instead of saying that, okay, got to take some risks, got to move outside these boundaries and these limitations, got to test things out, got to build up the courage, what do? More austerity, more reinforcement of limits, more self-denial, just keep deducing and reducing all realm of possibility. And then it can go to the other end of the spectrum too. I don't even know if it's the other end of the spectrum, but it can bring a lot of conformity in order to avoid the fear of failure and rejection, because you just can't be innovative, you can't be creative, you can't fully express yourself because there's that fear. And a lot of times in these instances, people become addicted to external validation that they are perfect, that they're doing the right thing, that they're not a failure, that they are not rejected. So they lose their individuality to, let's say, social institutions, just institutional expectations and just expectation that actually is limiting them. They're sacrificing the entirety of their sense of self and authenticity just to avoid this fear of failure and rejection again. And then probably worst of all is idealizing suffering. Like it gives someone a sense of meaning. That's what glorification of Saturn will eventually bring when Saturn is not a function, but the only function. So you idealize it, you better be prepared to be in a perpetual state of suffering. And then at some point, you have to rationalize the suffering, like suffering is giving me meaning. It's as if suffering is inherently something valuable. So, in a sense, this idealization of Saturn creates a self-imposed suffering. And oddly enough, a lot of time people rationalize this as moral superiority. Again, that confining, restrictive aspect of it, in the sense of constantly fearing rejection and failure, is again becoming life denying. That constriction is suffocating life, is suffocating the individual. And when you think about it, what is all of this, everything that we talked about so far, adding up to? You become the punisher of other people, and your way and mode of being in this world is always through some sort of a self-punishment. You're creating scarcity in the world. You're creating scarcity within yourself, creating hardship in the world. The world's giving you feedback. It becomes your hardship. You're setting limits and confining other people all the time and trying to control them. They have a feedback loop and they project those hardships right back at you because no one's cooperative. No one is nice. No one's receptive. No one is pleasant. Everything is just hard. Everyone is hard. And one of the prominent feelings that got nurtured through these kinds of feedback loop is resentment, contempt. It actually creates a kind of an ignorance in the mind about who the self is, what the world is like, what other people are like. That loving, soft, nurturing quality that's necessary in life to make it bearable, to make it pleasant, gets annihilated when the Saturnine way possesses us and we try to embody it. So yeah, that punishment aspect of it is very unhealthy. It's just creating more suffering in a lot of ways. And on some level, we know that these ways of living are not healthy. So there's always this subconscious guilt that goes along with these kinds of feeling and thinking too. And you see people who want to embody Saturn, they always feel like they have to atone for their perceived wrongdoings, even the perceived wrongdoings of the world. They have to somehow pay some sort of a penance for that. They have to do a penance. So again, it comes back to imposing harsh restrictions on themselves, on their environments. That control issue becomes dominant again, reinforcing it. And then there's this other double thought almost. If I suffer, and by enduring more suffering, like they weren't suffering enough so far, somehow this will restore things and absolve things, but it doesn't. It's almost like looking for validation through more hardship, internal validation and maybe external validation. Like you live such a hard life. And you see this with Saturnine people, they want to compete with you for misery, which is ridiculous. It's like you're trying to tell this Saturnine person who's glorifying Saturn, not a Saturnine person. Some people have a disposition that's just Saturnine. That's something I will talk about in another video, but this is people who glorify Saturn. So you're trying to tell them something about your pain and how you're grieving. They might give you 30 seconds and then they will just blow up with how much they're suffering and how bad their suffering is. And if you only knew how bad their suffering is and how the world is doing them wrong, and it's just like, all right, you win. You win for having the worst friggin' life. So this kind of validation is morbid. And then through this, then they want to say how resilient they are and how strong they are. That's the way that they want to get the validation, to portray that kind of an image, even though a lot of it is just self-imposed and they are the cause of it, but they cannot come to see it anymore because of that rock formation. So much is on top of another thing, one guilt after another, one situation. You just can't see what's underneath all of it. It's like they're locked in a state of constant deprivation and scarcity throughout their entire life. And it's just preventing them from seeing the fullness, the beauty, the loveliness that's in life and in other people, and in all the unpredictability and all the things changing and shifting all the time. There's actually beauty in that. They insist on suffering for its own sake, or it's just rationalized as to why they need to suffer. And the crazy thing is, all this stuff deepens that feeling of inadequacy and feeling very alienated and alone. Saturn brings abnormalities and perversion. So, glorification of Saturn and having our psychology get wired around these Saturn notion, strictly Saturn, because we're glorifying Saturn, it will bring abnormalities and perversions to the person. I was saying earlier, it creates a kind of an ignorance. It's like the person doesn't want to see the truth anymore. They just have rationalized everything, have become hard, and there's no movement. There's no flexibility anymore. And by glorifying Saturn in this way, you're just perpetuating cycles of self-punishment and self-denial. And when we do that, Saturn wants us to be responsible in a lot of ways, to be mature up, grow up. What the hell are you doing? You're responsible for other people. And a lot of time, that part of that responsibility is to feel alive, to feel joyful, to have a lot of vitality. That's the way we're actually able to take care of other people. If we could say anything about having control in life, that's the best that we can do. Just make sure that our mind is right, our body is right, and we show up to the world with something that we can offer it. When we become these Saturnine kind of ways, we're just negating everything at all times, every environment, every person, every situation. It's preventing growth. Life wants growth. Life in itself, in a lot of ways, is growth, is emergence and growth, and then it will intersect with Saturn, it will die, but it only dies because something else wants to grow. But when you become this agent of no, naysaying, negating, controlling, confining, suffocating, this is the antithesis of life. It destroys meaning, it destroys purpose. So we have to be aware when we embrace Saturn as an ideal, what we're doing to our own psychology, or where from our psychology this thing is stemming from. We have some self-work to do. Another psychological defense that can come out of this Saturn worship, because it's wiring our mind that way, or our mind has been wired that way, and that's why we're gravitating towards Saturn. Either way, it's something that we need to work through in life, is not trusting our emotions of others. And then this becomes a point of detachment. Saturn represents coldness, detachment. And such people, if they pay attention, they have a lot of problem with intimacy. They keep themselves emotionally distant from other people. They even keep themselves emotionally distant from themselves. Their emotions bother them. They prefer not to have emotions because that feels safer. That will prevent them from seeing their vulnerability. And when you dig deep, I mean, the person's shielding themselves off from certain emotions that they've had. But we all have to get to a point in life where we're like, all right, that thing that happened really hurt. That thing really sucked. It was very disappointing. Dopamine level was here after that event. It was like down there, and it stayed down there for 2 years, hence depression. But I'm not going to mistrust relationships. I'm not going to mistrust emotions. I'm not going to try to suppress and repress it. I mean, these tactics can protect us temporarily, but in the long run of life, becoming distrustful of emotions and other people's emotions is like a cold, dark, empty void of space that we live in. What defines so much of our humanity is how we feel. So to detach from emotions, it's killing our humanity. It makes us pessimistic about relationships, cynical about relationships. You see that in Saturn, in people who glorify Saturn, to have this pessimistic view of relationships. Like relationships inevitably lead to some sort of a hurt. So it's going to break up anyway. Why open up to that? Why be that way? I'm good by myself. We're social beings. We have to be careful of these kinds of statements and ways of thinking. We have to understand its source. And as social beings, we like to pretend this is not true, but no matter how independent we want to be, we are dependent beings. I mean, if we have the privilege of having 3 meals a day, we are dependent on the being and bodies of other beings, whether they're animals or plants. We're dependent on so many different things at all times. When I think about any instance of my life, that dependency might not be explicitly at play, but is the dependency that allowing me to be in that moment. Going back to the road, when I drive down the street and when I think about how many people's work, efforts, and life force has been invested to make that road, for me to be able to get from point A to B on time is unbelievable. It's the way we're all obeying the rules of the road. As I sit here right now, if you can see behind me, all those books, those are other people's minds. Those are other people's thoughts that I'm benefiting from. This cup was designed by someone, made by someone. We cannot pretend that we don't need other people, that we're okay with our loneliness. We're being ungrateful and we're being delusional. And again, Saturn wants us to understand reality, wants us to be in reality. So this whole thing of, I don't want to be emotionally involved, I'm cynical of relationships. When we say we human beings are social beings, this is what it means. And for a person who glorifies Saturn and wants to declare that no one and nothing matters and they're okay with their isolation and loneliness, they're just fooling themselves. They're rationalizing away the truth about the world that they live in. So again, Saturn as a function that it's by itself and not a function amongst many is collapsing life. It's destroying life again. And it's coming through this person's way of thinking. And I think I'm going to end it here. And I feel I got very passionate at some points in this talk because I've seen how devastating this way of thinking is. And even people who are not into astrology, you can see people glorify these ways of thinking without even understanding that this is the Saturn archetype that's not functioning well. It's the dysfunction of Saturn. You see it in different people and how it's manifesting in their lives and it's destroying their lives, and you want to intervene and you want to say something like there's more to life. But in general, this over-identification with the Saturn's archetype is talking about unresolved issues that we're holding within, harboring within. And it has to do with insecurities, guilt, fear. And the funny part is just regurgitating these things, recreating situations that has all of these components. So it becomes something that's constantly reinforcing itself in our psychology. And they're all, we could call them faulty coping mechanisms. They're defense mechanisms. And at some point, we have to get to the bottom of this to overcome the constraint and the limitation that Saturn represents and how we're just become these embodiment of it. And we're bringing it into the world constantly. We're making the world black. We're making ourselves heavy and weighing it down, like we're mourning, When you go to a funeral, there's a sense of heaviness to it. In cultures where they were black, some cultures they were white. But it's just this heaviness every time the person walks into the room or there's an interaction with them. And the unfortunate thing is this person needs love. This person needs receptivity. A lot of these problems are coming from that. That's the root cause of it. But as a defense mechanism against it, they're coming out in the world in that heavy way, and they're creating that feedback loop, which just makes it darker and darker, heavier and heavier, which doesn't help the person or anyone around them. Yeah, in a sense, the proper way of engaging with the Saturn archetype is to integrate it with all the other archetypes. It cannot be the sole focus. It cannot be idealized and glorified till we start embodying it and enacting it. And as I said, the feedback loop is not good. And if we are gravitating towards Saturn, it's worth sitting there and reflecting for a moment to see what the underlying things are, that we are actually gravitating towards a planet that represents hardship, suffering, death, illness, poverty. These are unpleasant topics in a human life. And if we have gravitation towards it, we should at least understand it. Whoa, that talk was heavy. And it was so heavy that I feel My head's like sinking onto my shoulder. So I will leave it off there for now, and I will come back to talk about Mars, K2, and Rahu. Those are some problematic archetypes to be idealizing and glorifying as well. I'm going to go do something very joyful, maybe have a piece of that Kit Kat bar. I don't know, but I need some lightness. That's it for now. Much love. Till next time.